Thank you all for coming this evening. If you could all turn off your cell phones, and let's welcome Jesse Myers.
So it's fitting that we are here today. The Wayward Concert Series that is sponsoring this program tonight sponsors 10 concerts a month of adventurous experimental music of the avant-garde. And it's also fitting that we are going to hear John Cage tonight. John Cage is really the king of experimental music. He's the one who got us talking about noise as music, ambient sound as music. And lastly, it's fitting that we are in Seattle because that is where the prepared piano was invented. And I want to talk a little bit about how John Cage invented the piano, or the prepared piano. But first, I kind of want to get into the head of John Cage prior to that. So he gave a talk here in Seattle in 1937, and this lecture was given at the Bonnie Bird House. Bonnie Bird was a modern dancer and worked with Martha Graham. And this talk is a little bit nonsensical, and if you know John Cage, you probably understand that probably didn't even matter to John Cage, that it didn't make much sense. But I'm going to try to have it make sense to you tonight. So this talk is actually the future of music credo. It's basically his manifesto about where he saw music going. And it doesn't make much sense if I was just to read it myself, because he keeps interrupting himself before he finishes the sentence with these big elaborations. So to help me with that, Amber's going to come up and read the main subject of where he sees the music going, and I'm going to interrupt her and read the elaboration. A lot like our marriage.
I believe that the use of noise.
Wherever we are, what we hear is mostly noise. When we ignore it, it disturbs us. When we listen to it, we find it fascinating. The sound of a truck at 50 miles an hour, static between the stations, rain. We want to capture and control these sounds, to use them not as sound effects, but as musical instruments. Every film studio has a library of sound effects recorded on film. With a film phonograph, it is now possible to control the amplitude and frequency of any one of these sounds and to give it the rhythms within or beyond the reach of the imagination. Given 4 film phonographs, we can compose and perform a quartet of explosive motor, wind, heartbeat, and landslide.
To make music.
If this word music is sacred and reserved for 18th and 19th century instruments, we can substitute a more meaningful term, the organization of sound.
Will continue and increase until we reach a music produced through the aid of electrical instruments.
Most inventors of electrical musical instruments have attempted to imitate 18th and 19th century instruments, just as early automobile designers copied the carriage. The Novacord and the Solovox are examples of this desire to imitate the past rather than construct the future. When theremin provided an instrument with genuinely new possibilities, thereminists, or the people that are performing the theremin, did their utmost to make the instrument sound like some old instrument, giving it a sickeningly sweet vibrato, and performing upon it with difficulty masterpieces from the past. Although the instrument is capable of a wide variety of sound qualities obtained by the turning of a dial, thereminists act as censors, giving the public those sounds that they think the public will like. We are shielded from new sound experiences. The special function of electrical instruments will be to provide complete control of the overtone structure of tones as opposed to noises, and to make these tones available in any frequency, amplitude, and duration.
Which will make available for musical purposes any and all sounds that can be heard. Photoelectric, film, and mechanical mediums for the synthetic production of music.
It is now possible for composers to make music directly, without the assistance of intermediary performers. Any design repeated often enough on a soundtrack is audible. 280 circles per second on a soundtrack will produce one sound, whereas a portrait of Beethoven, repeated 50 times per second on a soundtrack, will not only have a different pitch, but a different sound quality.
Will be explored. Whereas in the past, the point of disagreement has been between dissonance and consonance, it will be in the immediate future between noise and so-called musical sound. The present methods of writing music, principally those which employ harmony and its reference to particular steps in the field of sound, will be inadequate for the composer, who will be faced with the entire field of sound.
The composer, or the organizer of sound, will be faced not only with the entire field of sound, but also with the entire field of time. The frame, or fraction of a second, following established film technique, will probably be the basic unit of measurement of time. No rhythm will be beyond the composer's reach.
New methods will be discovered, bearing a definite relation to Schoenberg's 12-tone system.
Schoenberg's method assigns to each material, in a group of equal materials, its function with respect to the group. Harmony is assigned to each material in a group of unequal materials, its function with respect to the fundamental or most important material in the group. Schoenberg's method is analogous to a society in which the emphasis is on the group and the integration of the individual in the group.
And present methods of writing percussion music.
Percussion music is a contemporary transition from keyboard-influenced music to the all-sound music of the future. Any sound is acceptable to the composer of percussion music. He explores the academically forbidden non-musical field of sound insofar as manually possible. Methods of writing percussion music have as their goal the rhythmic structure of a composition. As soon as these methods are crystallized into one or several widely accepted methods, the means will exist for group improvisation of unwritten but culturally important music. This has already taken place in Oriental cultures and in hot jazz.
And any other methods which are free from the concept of a fundamental tone. The principle of form will be our only constant connection with the past. Although the great form of the future will not be as it was in the past, at one time the fugue and another the sonata, it will be related to these as they are to each other.
Before this happens, centers of experimental music must be established. In these centers, the new materials, oscillators, turntables, generators, means for amplifying small sounds, film, phonographs, etc., must be made available for use. Composers at work with 20th century methods for making music, performances of results, organization of sound for extra musical purposes, theater, dance, radio, and film.
Through the principle of organization or man's common ability to think.
So, how did we get here? Well, fast forward 3 years, and John Cage was working at Cornish in 1940, and he was writing a lot of dance music, percussion music, and a young woman named by the name of Sibylla Fort, who was Cornish's first African-American student, approached John Cage about writing some music for her dance, which was based on an African theme. So naturally, she wanted something percussive, but the stage was not very big, maybe about the size of this. Piano was smaller, and it wasn't big enough to fit the dancer, the piano, and a battery of percussion instruments. So inspired by one of his teachers, Henry Cowell, he started to look inside the piano for other possibilities. And he started by placing pipe plates on the strings that moved around. It sounded cool, but it moved around and didn't stay in place long enough for a performance. So then he went to nails, they slipped through the strings, and finally the screws, the threading of the screws kept it in place for a performance. And for that particular performance, he rounded out the preparations with some weather stripping in between the strings and gave it this thud, this drum-like quality. So the result was this very, very percussive, high-energy African dance music with a piano. The music that we're going to hear today happened 6 years later, and Cage refined the prepared piano with lots of other things, plastic, nuts and bolts, little pieces of rubber, and was very specific on the placement of it. And so I want to talk a little bit about the handout that I gave you. So you have this little paper along with it. And you can follow along with my discussion if you want. It kind of has the outline of what I plan on talking about today. And it also has the explanation, or the table rather, which is here. So this is what I use to prepare the piano. And as you can see here, there's a lot of preparations that go into this. The first time it took me about 4 hours. I got it down to about an hour and a half. So, and you can see here we have basically a pitch, and then the material that's being used, the placement between the strings, and then another space for a material being used, and then where it goes, and then finally a third bit of material that's being used for one note. So any note can have 3 preparations for this particular piece. Sometimes just one. Like for the whole high end of the piano, we basically have just 1 preparation per note. If you work your way a quarter of the way down, you see that I have 3 preparations for one note. I have a screw between strings 1 and 2. I have a furniture bolt and 2 nuts between strings 2 and 3, and then also a screw and 2 nuts between those 2 strings as well. So, and then he continues to use things more like rubber and plastic in the middle of the piano, and then finally at the very bottom, an eraser like we used to have in grade school. So let's talk about what some of this stuff sounds like, the fun stuff. So a screw and a bolt gives it this chime-like quality. So here's one of the preparations on the lower end that has a couple of bolts in it. So it gives it this gong-like sound at the high end, and much more of a, I guess, a chime-like on the higher end. All of those are screws or bolts. In the middle of the piano, I have pieces of rubber that doesn't have any metal in there, no screws or bolts. There's a piece of rubber. Gives it a sort of a wooden block-like sound. Right in the middle of the piano is plastic and rubber mixed. An odd sort of pitch bend. It kind of reminds me of like little leather hand drums and bongos. And then there are 3 preparations, or 3 different notes on the piano that actually use nuts, and they get sort of a rattle. So there's a lot of choices for the performer, because if you look at that preparation or the table, you see screw, bolt, and well, if you go to Hardwick's like I did and ask the guy for a screw, he will look at you kind of funny, because there's a lot of screws out there. So I had to make that decision on kind of what fits and what I liked, and there is relative sound, but the big thing that he's really specific about is placement. So I wanted to kind of show you what some of those differences actually are. So I have 3 different sizes of hardware here. This is what I'm using as a furniture bolt. Very large and heavy. It's really the weight that makes the difference, and he doesn't tell us anything about weight. Here's medium-sized furniture bolt that I'm using. And finally, a little bolt. So I'm going to choose one of these notes that actually isn't prepared. So you can kind of experience the difference between these sounds. That's the smallest screw. Pretty dramatic change. Now he's very specific about where this actually has to go, so that's not a variable for me, but it does make a difference in the sound of it. Here it is, half an inch more. Changes the harmonics of the note. Stops the string short. For a deeper harmonic, if I use a heavier bolt, it's really the same placement, you see, but it's just a heavier material. And then finally, this big fat guy here. Same exact position, a completely different sound. That's kind of awesome. I kind of want to leave it there, actually. I'll take it. Okay. So that's basically the preparations and the sounds that they make. But Cage didn't stop there. There are pedals on the piano, and there's 2 pedals that he uses a lot in this piece. One is the sustain pedal. Normally what that does is it sustains a pitch. Take my hands off the piano and it still makes that note ring. If I play that note without the sustain pedal, it pretty much sounds the same. I just don't have to hold it. This is not what happens with Cage's prepared piano. Let's take this eraser down here on the bass, for instance. It's a low thud, right? And watch what happens when we press the sustain pedal. That's amazing. It's no longer a piano at all. I mean, one thing he used to say is, this shouldn't look like one of your friends who puts on a funny costume and is just wearing a hat. You can tell it's your friend. This is a complete transformation. This is no longer a piano. Another thing that he uses a lot is the left pedal. What the left pedal does is it shifts all the hammers to the right. So normally when I'm playing a piece of music that's not prepared, it allows me to play softer because it just selects 2 strings for every note, giving it a softer sound because it eliminates one of the strings. But as you know, from the chart here, he doesn't always have every string of that note prepared. So we can start to pick out sounds or preparations for any given note. So for instance, here's a scale going down the piano without the pedal. Now I have the left pedal and I get to isolate every one of those pitches. Notes zigzag all over the place. As I head down, notes sometimes go up, they go down. It's a little disorienting, but get used to it. So let's talk a little bit about the music then. So the music of the Sonatas and Interludes is really a structure of 20 pieces. It's a symmetrical design, so if you're looking at the very front of your handout today, you'll see Sonata 1, Sonata 2, Sonata 3, Sonata 4, etc. And there'll be interludes dispersed among them. So it's symmetrical from beginning to end. 4 sonatas at the beginning, 4 sonatas at the end. Interludes evenly dispersed among them. The structure of each one of these sonatas is modeled after Scarlatti's sonatas, which are really short sonatas. It's not like the sonatas of Beethoven or Mozart's multi-movement works that last 20 minutes. It's really a small, single movement work with repeats. So you have 2 equal parts, and they get repeated. So if it sounds like this music is repeating, it's exactly what's happening. It really is repeating. And lastly, it's composed on a rhythmic structure. This is the confusing part, and I thought about not sharing this with you today, and afraid that it might confuse you, but I think you can handle it. So rhythmic structure, really what we're talking about here is time. So when we talk about rhythm, we're really talking about time. Pieces in the past were structured by harmony. Obviously, I can't harmonize things with traditional chords when they don't make your typical sound. So harmony's out the window, right? So the rhythmic structure that he's using is really based on fractals. Something he called a micro-macro cosmic structure. And that is things at the small level, phrases at the small level, relate to that of the whole. And so finally, in your handouts there, I have some sheet music. And if you don't read sheet music, that's fine. I don't think you have to really appreciate what I'm talking about in terms of this fractal design. So I have labeled here 9 bars along the top of every line, and then the bracket stops, and then you get another 9 bars, etc. So you can follow that along to one set of 9 bars, another set of 9 bars, another set of 9 bars, one more set of 9 bars, and finally 4.5 bars. Now 4.5 is half of 9. So if we count all those up, 1, 2, 3, 4.5. Now remember that this music is repeated. So 4.5 times 2 is 9. So the duration at the small level relates to that of the whole. Okay? A micro and macro relationship. And the last thing today that I really want to talk to you about is ways to better appreciate this music, to give some context to what you're hearing tonight. And James Pritchett is a Cage scholar and wrote several books on John Cage, and he suggests 6 different ways of actually listening to this music. I'm going to share 2 of them with you today. One is to think of it as a masterpiece. I think it's a masterpiece. I'm sure other people would agree with me. But it's different than a masterpiece of the past. You know, this is not Bach's Goldberg variations or Beethoven's Diabelli variations. This is much different. This is music, or this is a masterpiece without a grand melody, without a sweeping climax, and without this showy ending. It has a quiet voice. Now, as much as I would love to give you the showy ending and finish the composition and have you all jump up to your feet and say, "Bravo, Jesse!" That's probably not going to happen, because this is the composition of the quiet voice, right? The masterpiece with the quiet voice. And lastly, to listen to this music as rasavant music. And rasa is the Hindu aesthetic theory of moods, or emotional characters. So there are 4 light moods and there are 4 dark moods. And the 4 light moods are the erotic, the heroic, the wondrous, and the comic. And the 4 dark moods are the repulsive, the angry, the fearful, and the sorrowful. All of these moods end up leading towards tranquility, the 9th mood. Okay? So try hearing each one of these pieces as a mood. And so if you hear the first one is repulsive, that might be the case. That might be what Cage intended. We don't really know what Cage intended. But what we do know is that the final 4 sonatas are about tranquility. So just as the rasa eventually go towards tranquility, John Cage's Sonatas and Interludes finish with 4 sonatas about tranquility. So John Cage's Sonatas and Interludes.